Congress in 2009. She gave up chairing the then Insular Affairs Subcommittee in this committee to go on to Energy and Commerce for the express purpose of working to provide Medicaid parity for the territories. So welcome, Donna, and Luis, and Christina. It is good to see you both three, to see the three of you. In today's hearing, we will be focusing on the shame on me. I apologize. Shame on me, but I'll continue. Um, in today's hearing, we will be focusing on the historical inequities of the application of federal programs in U.S. territories of Puerto Rico, Guam, the U.S. Virgin Islands, American Samoa, and the Northern Mariana Islands, and what we can do to obtain parity for Americans who call the territories home. Earlier this year, I joined Chairman Grijalva and my territorial delegates in a letter to the Biden administration requesting that federal programs be expanded to the territories and included in the president's budget. We explained that Americans residing in U.S. territories face long-standing barriers that limit or exclude them from equal access to Medicaid, the SSI program, and SNAP and TANF, the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, among many others. And that expanding eligibility in these important federal programs to residents of the U.S. territories aligns with President Biden's commitment to providing equal opportunity to all Americans and ending systemic racism. I am extremely grateful to President Biden for agreeing with us and acknowledging the need for territory parity by proposing in his budget requests for fiscal year 2022 equal application of Medicaid, SSI, and SNAP. The extension of this and other federal assistance programs to the territories is crucial to improving healthcare, nutrition, and overall quality of life for nearly 3.5 million Americans. This was truly welcome news for those of us who have been advocating for this for many years. I am sure that all territorial representatives in Congress, former and current, have worked on bringing state-like treatment for programs to the insular areas. And even though the president's budget does not contain specific funding recommendations, we welcome this historic step, a small step, but historic, and must do what is necessary to deliver on the president's commitment to advance equity and provide the required help to the substantially underserved, largely minority communities in the territories. The president's call for parity comes just months before all the territories face a Medicaid funding cliff. Supplemental funds expire at the end of this fiscal year on September 30. Federal Medicaid matching rates in the territories are much lower than those provided to states, and Medicaid funds are subjected to an annual cap. Just last week, the Energy and Commerce Committee approved H.R. 4406 to extend supplemental Medicaid cliffs for the territories through fiscal year 2029. Under the terms of this bill, the Northern Marianas, for example, will receive over $482 million in Medicaid funding over the next 8 years, with an 83% federal and 17% local match. While this bill is welcome and very much appreciated, the ultimate goal is to make its provisions permanent and to do the same with SNAP, SSI, and other programs. I recognize that some may not see the rationale for holding a hearing on policy matters outside natural resources jurisdictions. I would remind those who hold this view that all matters regarding the United States insular areas are well within the Natural Resources Committee's jurisdictions. I would also point out that we held a hearing in this committee in May of 2019 to discuss the Medicaid cliff that all insular areas were facing that year, which unfortunately we're facing again, putting the health of thousands of low-income Americans at risk during a pandemic. Medicaid and healthcare officials from all the territories testified on the life and death consequences on cutting off supplemental Medicaid funding. That hearing was quickly followed by one in Energy and Commerce Health Subcommittee where territory Medicaid directors again testified. The hearings indeed made an impact. We lit a fire under the Medicaid issue, extended supplemental funding for 2 years, and quite likely saved some lives. President Biden's call for parity for the territories is a crucial first step for equal treatment for Americans in non-STEP state areas. We must capitalize on the momentum that the president's pledge has provided, starting with today's hearing. Now, let me yield to the vice ranking member for her opening statement. Ms. Gonzalez Colon, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. And territories are treated unequally under federal programs when compared to the states. And this has effects beyond the mere fiscal burden to territories. It directly impacts the well-being of all Americans living here as well. For instance, under Medicaid, Puerto Rico's federal matching assistance percentage, or FMAP, is set to be 55%. And its current level of funding is merely $392 million. I have filed HR 2217 that will remove the statutory FMAP for Puerto Rico and the rest of the territories. And I have joined my colleagues in legislation that will eliminate the funding limitations we have in federal financing. All these bills are bipartisan. Unfortunately, none of these bills have moved. Yet, Puerto Rico and the rest of the territories will face the medical cliff on September the 30th. Instead, together with the Leadership in Energy and Commerce Committee, we are working to address this cliff through HR 4406, the supporting Medicare for U.S. territories. And these bills embodies a bipartisan agreement to extend for 5 years the current funding levels at 76% of FMAP and at $3 billion. This agreement will not solve the systemic underfunding of our Medicaid program, nor it will provide the residents of Puerto Rico with all the benefits that Congress has mandated. Only equality will give us that. However, a consensus agreement would allow 1.5 million Medicaid recipients to maintain their benefits and avoid cutting provider payments. Another program in which we are treated differently is the Supplemental Security Income, or SSI. I have introduced HR 537 to provide Puerto Rico and the rest of the excluded territories equal access under this program. The justification for denying SSI benefits to the Americans living in Puerto Rico dates from 1935, when Congress excluded us from all titles of original or Social Security Act, reasoning that the island had its own tax law and did not pay federal taxes. Both federal district court in Puerto Rico and the First Circuit have held that what is more than evident, that the justification for exclusion from the Oversight program of poor, elderly, disabled, and blind individuals residing in Puerto Rico has long ceased to be valid. Puerto Rico residents not only make substantial contributions to the federal treasury, but have consistently made them in higher amounts than taxpayers in at least 6 states. We cannot continue to logically insist on the lack of payment of federal taxes as a valid excuse to deny the application of a program which almost by definitions requires that its beneficiaries to earn too little to pay federal taxes. We cannot justify the exclusion of a class of people from benefits when the reason for their exclusion is based precisely on meeting the requirements of the program. Federal nutrition assistance is another area under which Puerto Rico receives inequitable treatment. Our nutritional assistance program, or NAP, is capped by a block grant that receives $1.9 billion a year and has over 1.5 million beneficiaries. Because NAP cannot expand based on demand, Congress has to allocate additional funding in the aftermath of emergencies such as hurricanes, earthquakes, and most recently the pandemic. This is unsustainable, and it does not guarantee that we will get the necessary funding and therefore to recover. And therefore, I support a transition to SNAP, and I am working with relevant agencies and stakeholders toward this goal. President Biden promised during his campaign to champion the removal of these arbitrary limitations and included support for these 3 programs in his budget request. Unfortunately, it's also true that under his administration, the DOJ has decided to continue defending the law that excludes Puerto Rico residents from the SSI. Since I've been in Congress, I have worked towards ending these constraints in the programs that treat Puerto Rico differently with Republicans and Democrats alike, and I will continue to do so. But let me be clear, as long as Puerto Rico is a territory, our access and treatment of the federal programs will never be safe, just as Congress can provide equal treatment today, but it could take it away tomorrow. Parity is not a permanent solution. Only statehood guarantees equal access to those vital federal programs for the 3.3 million Americans on the island. I think this is a great opportunity to revise all legislation that is bipartisan, looking for that bipartisan, as I just said, support to gain access to those federal programs, not just the ones that I mentioned, but many others that treat all territories differently from the states. Having said that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Gonzalez Colon. The chairman of the full committee, Mr. Grijalva, is with us. Mr. Chairman, would you like to give us an opening statement, please?
No, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And no, I just to thank you for the hearing and to I'll wait for my opportunity to ask questions. Thank you a lot. Appreciate the courtesy.
Thank you. Now we could go and towards the introduction of the witnesses. Before introducing the witnesses, I will remind the witnesses themselves that they are encouraged to participate in the Witness Diversity Survey created by the Congressional Office of Diversity and Inclusion. Witnesses may refer to their hearing invitation materials for further information. With us today, we have the Honorable Donna Christensen, a doctor and a former U.S. representative representing the U.S. Virgin Islands. Welcome, Donna. Welcome, Madam Chair. We also have the Honorable Luis G. Fortuno, former resident commissioner for Puerto Rico here in Congress, and also former governor of Puerto Rico. Welcome, Governor. The Honorable Cristina Marie Sablan, who now chairs the Committee on Health and Welfare of the Northern Marianas Commonwealth Legislature. Ms. Sablan also is a former staffer of the Marianas Congressional Office, so welcome, Tina. Ms. Judith Solomon, a senior fellow of the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, very well submitted testimony, and I had a chance to go over them a little bit. And we have counselor, we have Mr. Ronnie Jacob, a partner of Calvo Fisher and Jacob LLP, and I think Mr. Jacobs was an attorney with a lawsuit filed by twins, I understand, from Guam, who qualified for SSI, and then upon moving to Guam, was disqualified. Let me remind the witnesses that under our committee rules, they must limit their oral statements to 5 minutes, but that their entire statement will appear in the hearing record. When you begin, the timer will begin, and it will turn orange when you have 1 minute remaining. So I recommend that members and witnesses joining remotely use the stage view so they may pin the timer on their screen. After your testimony is complete, please remember to mute yourself to avoid any inadvertent background noise. I will also allow the entire panel to testify before questioning the witnesses will commence. So the chair now recognizes Dr. Christensen. Dr. Christensen, please unmute yourself, and you have 5 minutes, not more than 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good afternoon, Vice Chairman Sablan, Vice Ranking Member Gonzalez Colon, Chairman Grijalva, committee members, and fellow panelists, and thank you for holding this hearing and for the opportunity to testify on the long, unfinished journey to full and fair treatment for the territories under the important programs of SNAP, SSI, and Medicaid. President Biden's budget statement on ending territorial inequity makes this hearing extremely important. I've been asked to testify on my experiences from my practice in Congress. So just to cite a few from my practice, I not having SSI, for example, caused persons to lose it if they moved home or to have to move to the states to get it. Because of the very low Medicaid poverty level used, many very low income persons were not eligible and their health suffered. Needed long-term care and services were limited, and some off-island hospitals would refuse our referrals because we had not paid past bills. We must never go back to that time. I'll begin with SNAP because it's a program where the BI has had equity. Our benefits take into account our higher food costs. There are 26,776 persons now being served by the SNAP program, and the average individual benefit is now over $200 per month. It must be extended to Puerto Rico, Northern Marianas, and American Samoa. Turning to SSI, the effort to extend it to the territories began almost immediately as the first territorial delegates were sworn into Congress, beginning with legislation by Ron DeLugo in 1973. When Congresswoman Bordalia and I introduced it in 1999, it did not include Puerto Rico because Puerto Rico seemed headed to statehood and would have it, and adding that would have increased the cost. Puerto Rico was later added. The territories, though, instead receive age, disabled, and blind funding. Today, 953 Virgin Islanders receive a monthly allowance of $187. In contrast, SSI monthly payments are from $1,400 to over $1,800 per month. So to add insult to injury, we American citizens are denied a benefit that some non-citizens enjoy. This treatment of Americans is shameful and must be ended. On Medicaid, the first legislation to lift the cap was introduced by resident Commissioner Balthazar in 1977. In the year that I was elected, the federal cap for the Virgin Islands was at $4.2 million, and income eligibility was capped at $5,000. In 2000, Congresswoman Bordalia and I introduced my first bill to give a state-like treatment, and delegates, including our current delegate, Stacey Plaskett, have steadfastly and stridently continued that effort. By 2008, the BI cap was at $13,020,000, and eligibility was only still at $5,500. 6,678 individuals were enrolled. Later, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act increased the cap to 18.2 million. When the prospect of healthcare reform presented opportunities to move the ball forward, the Tri-Caucus insisted on state-like treatment in Medicaid being a goal. We began meetings with Chairman Rangel and Waxman and spoke at caucus meetings, including those that the president attended, to make our case. Unfortunately, we did not get state-like treatment, but the House Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act included $10.35 billion for Medicaid, a match of $75.25, and $4 billion for the exchange. Unfortunately, though, the Senate and White House were only at a 30% increase in Medicaid. Several very tough meetings with the president and Senate leadership got results, but eventually the final ACA funding for Medicaid was reduced by $4 million, the exchanges by $3 million, and the match was changed only to $55.45. Again, state-like treatment had eluded us. We've still made a lot of progress. Since 2017, our eligibility is at $15,654 for a one-person household, and $20,833 if that person is over 65, aged or blind, age disabled or blind. Today, 33,540 individuals are enrolled in our Medicaid program. But Medicaid has been continuously in a state of uncertainty. We only narrowly missed the cliff because of 2 Category 5 hurricanes, and again because of the COVID pandemic. While we greatly appreciate the extensions, it should not take catastrophes to get more equitable treatment. We are grateful to the bipartisan agreement and Congressman Soto and Baracus having introduced HR 4406, which would give us 8 additional years with enhanced matches, but it does not take us to what must be our North Star. Therefore, I'm in strong support of Chairman Sablan's HR 421, those of the Vice Ranking Member, and the legislation introduced by Congresswomen Velasquez and Plaskett, HR 2713 and HR 3434. Although they include other important provisions, they would end shameful discriminatory treatment of American citizens based on where we live.
All right.
We have all stepped on this issue for far too many years, and too many people have suffered.
You should.
President Biden's assertion of the FY22 budget provides an unprecedented window of opportunity that may never come again. Congress must act this year and ask the Tri-Caucus for help. It may be now or never. It has been a long road with anxieties, disappointments, and frustrations of our efforts, but we are ready to stand with you for health and fairness for my fellow Virgin Islanders and all Americans living in the territories of the United States. I thank you again for this hearing and for the opportunity to testify, but most importantly, I thank you for your sensitivity to the inequity that exists for us in our country's safety net programs, your determination to put on record and thereby undergird and jumpstart the Herculean effort that must take place to end the long-standing discriminatory treatment of American citizens who happen to live in our nation's territories. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Out of very high respect for Dr. Kennedy, she went over her time. There are members here that will not stand out, and we appreciate. Please keep your questions and/or your testimonies to 5 minutes. I now recognize Governor Fortuno. Governor Fortuno, you have 5 minutos.
Thank you, Vice Chairman Sablan and Vice Ranking Member Gonzalez Colon for this opportunity to testify on the disparities in federal programs in the U.S. As a former member of Congress and Governor of Puerto Rico, I'll emphasize my remarks on the specific challenges the American citizens residing in Puerto Rico face on Medicaid, Supplemental Security Income, and the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. These are 3 of the over 40 federal programs in which U.S. territories, including Puerto Rico, are treated different from the states. Currently, federal law caps Puerto Rico's Medicaid federal medical assistance percentage at 55% and $395 million. The other territories suffer from similar treatment. Because these statutory caps are so patently insufficient to meet the needs of the territory's population, their governments have had to rely on short-term funding infusions every 1 or 2 years for most of the last decade. However, this temporary funding has always been at much lower levels than needed to address the healthcare conditions of the U.S. citizens in the territories. This long-standing inequitable treatment has led to lower levels of care, inadequate reimbursement to providers, and reduced access to coverage. Due to the insufficient funding, 7 of the 17 Medicaid required benefits are not available in Puerto Rico. To a great degree, due to this dire situation, the island's population suffers from higher rates of hypertension, diabetes, asthma, HIV/AIDS, and other chronic medical conditions. Additionally, a significant number of healthcare providers have moved to the mainland for better working conditions. It should be self-evident by now that these Medicaid cliffs and stopgap measures create significant uncertainty, impede long-term planning, and are not an acceptable way to govern. Instead, Governor Pierluisi and Congresswoman Gonzalez have advocated for a long-term solution that promotes state-like treatment. I agree with them and hope that Congress will legislate accordingly. The extension of SSI benefits to residents of the territories is currently subject to judicial review. Said legal action relates to Mr. Baello Madero, who during his entire adult life worked and paid taxes in the U.S. mainland. He began receiving SSI disability benefits while residing in the state of New York. The following year, he moved to Puerto Rico to assist his ailing wife and continued to receive said benefits, not knowing that his change in address made him ineligible to receive the same. In 2016, he applied for retirement benefits, and the Social Security Administration became aware of his new home address and ceased SSI benefit payments. The U.S. Department of Justice filed a lawsuit invoking a criminal statute against him and demanded recovery of over $28,000 in SSI benefits received while residing in Puerto Rico. Mr. Baello Madero's counsel argued that this action discriminated against the residents of the U.S. territories and violated the U.S. Constitution's guarantee of equal protection. The U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals and the U.S. District Court ruled that discrimination against the island's residents with respect to the SSI program failed judicial review under any legal standard. This determination will be reviewed by the U.S. Supreme Court later this year. Instead of SSI, the island received supplemental assistance through the Aid to the Aged, Blind, and Disabled program. Puerto Rico is recently excluded from SNAP and instead has the Nutrition Assistance Program, funded by Congress every year at a set cap of approximately $1.9 billion. When a disaster strikes, Puerto Rico has to rely on emergency appropriations to cover any additional expenses related to increased participation. This can place additional burdens on state agencies that need to prepare for either receiving additional funds or for potentially dropping participants that join after an emergency because they do not have the needed funds to keep them in the program. Like Congresswoman Gonzalez, I believe a transition to SNAP should be considered to provide for proper nutrition assistance on the island. All of these programs are designed to assist those citizens in greater need among us. An American living in poverty in the continental United States is no more needy, vulnerable, or deserving of assistance than an American living in poverty in a territory. There is no justifiable reason for this exclusion. This is especially true given the valor and courage shown by over 225,000 veterans from Puerto Rico that have served in our armed forces since U.S. citizenship was granted to the island residents in 1917, as well as our 9 Medal of Honor recipients, or the more than 1,900 that made the ultimate sacrifice in defense of freedom and our nation. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to any questions that you may have. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Wow, perfect timing, Governor. Thank you very much. Perfect timing. And I'd like to recognize the Honorable Christina Marie Sablan. Ms. Sablan, you have 5 minutes, please. Thank you. I think you have to unmute yourself.
My apologies. Okay, let's try that again.
Fine.
Good day, Chairman Grijalva, Vice Chairman Sablan, Ranking Member Westerman, Vice Ranking Member Gonzalez Colon, and distinguished members of this committee. Thank you for conducting this important hearing on Medicaid, SSI, and SNAP parity for the territories. We in the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands commend and thank President Biden for making parity for all Americans in critical federal programs a priority in his administration. And we applaud his call to end our second-class citizenship. President Biden recognizes, as we do, that based solely on where we live, the people of the Northern Marianas, Guam, American Samoa, Virgin Islands, and Puerto Rico are second-class citizens of this nation. Approximately 4 million people reside in the territories of the United States. Of those, about 54,000 live in the Northern Marianas. Although we are part of the American political family, we are not equals with our fellow Americans in the States. Our delegates do not vote in Congress, our people cannot vote for president, and our access to vital federal programs is inferior. In the States, funding for Medicaid and nutrition assistance is open-ended based on need. In the Northern Marianas, funding for these programs is fixed in statute. Time and again, we have had to rely on Congress to provide supplemental funding, and our most vulnerable citizens have experienced the devastating effects when Congress has been slow to respond. In March 2019, the Commonwealth's Medicaid program ran out of money halfway through the fiscal year. This happened 5 months after Super Typhoon U2 destroyed our islands. Medicaid beneficiaries and providers were notified that the program was broke and there was nothing left for reimbursements. People deferred care, stopped taking medications they could not afford, and prayed. In October 2020, after enrollment in the Nutrition Assistance Program spiked 46%, and faced with the prospect of federal money running out, our governor, Ralph Torres, slashed food aid to thousands of struggling families in the middle of the pandemic. The Commonwealth still had $23 million for NAP, but was projected to expend all these funds within 6 months. For families out of work because of COVID-19, who had been waiting months for pandemic unemployment assistance, the pain inflicted by the governor's cuts was excruciating. They had no income, no PUA, and suddenly less food. Eventually, in both these cases, Congress did come through with supplemental funding, and Medicaid and NAP benefits were restored within a few months. But these examples underscore how disparities in crucial federal programs have dire consequences for people living in American territories. The inequities sharpen in times of disaster and economic hardship. During the pandemic, enrollment in Medicaid in the Marianas has more than doubled, from approximately 16,000 residents before COVID-19 to nearly 33,000 this year. Over 12,500 residents are enrolled in NAP today, about a quarter of our total population. Yet funding remains fixed. Yes, supplemental appropriations from Congress have made it possible to meet the surge in need. Without the generous assistance of the federal government, we in the Northern Marianas would be in a far worse position today. So we thank you, members of Congress, for all the federal aid we have received in the Commonwealth for disaster recovery and COVID-19 relief. We are further encouraged by proposals in Congress to improve treatment of the territories in key federal programs. H.R. 4406 extends Medicaid funding for the territories and provides enhanced federal matching rates. H.R. 421 brings the Commonwealth closer to full inclusion in SNAP. And there is more funding for nutrition assistance in the President's fiscal year 2022 budget, including $30 million for the Northern Marianas, 2.5 times more than we currently receive in the annual block grant. Yes, more funding helps mitigate disparities in federal programs, but true equity requires more enduring solutions. Vulnerable Americans living in the territory should not have to worry about federal programs running out of money for food and healthcare, especially after disasters or economic downturns. Without full parity and funding that can be adjusted based on need, there will always be insecurity and instability in these programs. Congress has a moral imperative to provide parity and make equitable investments in the health and well-being of all Americans, no matter where we live in the nation. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today.
Wow, another perfect timing, Ms. Dina, except that we lost your video halfway through your testimony.
I will try that again.
We don't have to promote the fact that we still have broadband problems in the Marianas. But thank you very much. I'd now like to recognize Ms. Judith Solomon, a senior fellow on the Budget and Policy Priorities. Ms. Solomon, you have 5 minutes, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Grijalva, Vice Chair Sablan, Vice Ranking Member Gonzalez Colon, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today on Medicaid in the territories. There are 3 ways federal law treats residents of the territories far less favorably than residents of the states when it comes to their Medicaid coverage. First, states receive open-ended federal funds that match a specified percentage of their expenditures for Medicaid-covered health services provided to enrollees. This means funds are available when need increases due to a recession, pandemic, or natural disasters. The territories, in contrast, receive only fixed block grant funding, which does not come close to covering the cost of healthcare for their Medicaid enrollees and puts territories at even greater risk when need increases. Second, in the states, the percentage of Medicaid costs that the federal government covers is based on a state's per capita income relative to that of the nation as a whole. But the territories draw down their federal block grant funds at a matching rate set in statute at 55%, well below what the rate would be if the territories per capita income, if it was based on territories per capita income. Third, the territories aren't subject to the same eligibility and benefit standards as state programs, in large part because they aren't given the financial resources to meet these standards. They are allowed to set their own eligibility standards that aren't based on the federal poverty line, and most of the territories have eligibility thresholds lower than those in the states. And not all the territories cover all the health services that the states must cover. The inadequacy of the block grant and the statutory matching rate has led to repeated time-limited tranches of supplemental funding to stave off draconian cuts the territories would have had to make in eligibility benefits and provider payments. The most recent 2-year fix expires on September 30th. Temporary fixes have not allowed the territories to improve their programs or provide coverage and benefits equal to the states, and they have left territory residents without a stable source of health care. For example, Puerto Rico recently increased provider reimbursement rates, which were so low they impeded access, and increased its very low eligibility threshold. But because of funding uncertainty, both increases will expire on September 30th. The bipartisan bill approved by the Energy and Commerce Committee on July 21st would provide 5 years of funding to Puerto Rico and 8 years to the other territories, but the funding would be flat. While the funding would avert the September 30th cliff, flat funding presents a risk that the block grants may be insufficient to sustain the territory's Medicaid programs over the 5 or 8 year period covered by the bill. The risk is especially great if the current pandemic continues for a longer period, or the territories experience natural disasters such as hurricanes, cyclones, or typhoons, all events that have hit the territories hard in recent years. If the territories continue to face funding cliffs and to operate under a block grant structure, they can't ensure that their residents have ongoing access to the full range of healthcare they need. Reaching parity with state programs requires increasing eligibility, benefits, and provider reimbursement, which is not possible with inadequate capped allotments, even when supplemented by temporary increases. Thus, while it's critical to address the cliff that the territories face on September 30th, it's also critical to begin moving to a permanent solution that would abolish the capped allotments and inadequate statutory matching rate and provide the territories with the open-ended funding they need to meet the needs of their residents in the same way as if they lived in the state. Forthcoming action on the President's recovery package provides an opportunity to do just that in line with President Biden's budget proposal. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify. I look forward to answering your questions.
Wow, thank you. Another, I mean, we're all making up. No, Donna, don't worry, we're making up for time. And I now like to recognize Mr. Rodney Jacobs, counselor. You have 5 minutes, sir. Please.
Thank you, Vice Chairman. I'd like to thank Chairman Grijalva, of course, Chairman Sablan, and Vice Ranking Member Gonzalez Colon. Of course, say good morning today to my own Congressman, San Nicolas. And thank you for inviting this really important testimony. My testimony today, this morning out in Guam, will focus on the real human impact that the denial of supplemental security income, or SSI benefits, means to those of us living here on Guam. I wanted to focus on one concrete example involving the National SSI program. My name again is Rodney Jacob. I am from Guam and I'm a lawyer. I'm also one of the lawyers who brought suit in the district court, the federal court of Guam, to rectify a great injustice to Katrina Schaller and her brother-in-law and sister, Kim Fegger and Dr. John Fegger, who are also Katrina's guardians. As we know, SSI is a program that provides financial assistance to the very most vulnerable people in our society, in our country, the elderly, the blind, and the disabled. It supports millions of qualified Americans. And Guam's legislature found that should Congress extend this benefit to Guam, some 24,000 of our residents will be eligible. So that sets the table a little bit. Now let me tell you about Katrina and her twin sister, Leslie. They were born in Pennsylvania in 1970. They both have myotonic dystrophy, which is a debilitating and incurable genetic disorder that causes long-term degeneration of muscle function. For most of her life, Katrina lived with her mom in Pennsylvania. There, Katrina and Leslie applied for and were granted SSI benefits by the Social Security Administration. But when mom died in 2007, Katrina had no other living member that could care for her other than her older sister, Kim, who lives on Guam in the village of Sinahanya with her husband, Dr. John Fegger. Now, Dr. John was born here on Guam. He went to the University of Guam. He's got 5 brothers and sisters and are part of a larger, deep-rooted community here. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about Dr. Fegger because he's a great doctor. But it's about this saga. He was the product of many high-profile residency programs. He could have had his choice to go anywhere to perform his medical services in the country, in the mainland or Hawaii. But he chose home, Guam, USA, and he and Kim have raised their children here. But that choice to come home would mean many years later that his family would have to face an anguishing choice because of the discriminatory application of SSI. When they told the SSA official in Pennsylvania that Katrina would be relocating to Guam, the official told them that the SSA would terminate Katrina's benefits because residents of Guam are not part of the United States for purposes of SSI. Imagine that, not part of the United States. Katrina's medical needs required her to live here on Guam with her sister. There is no other brother or sister that can care for her in the country. And the SSA terminated her benefits on January 1st, 2009. What is even more heartbreaking is the story concerning her twin sister, Leslie, who is in assisted living in Pennsylvania for now. Katrina and Leslie FaceTime each other every day. Their dream is to see each other once again. But because Guam's not part of the US for purposes of SSI, Leslie will lose her benefits if she travels to Guam for more than 30 days. She is physically incapable of that trip of such a short duration if she suffers from the same debilitating disease that Katrina suffers from, and it is progressing. Is this situation unfair? Well, of course it is. Is it wrong? Yes. And is it discriminatory? Absolutely. It's just it's contrary to common sense, human decency, and sound public policy to deny these important public benefits to American citizens just because they live on Guam. But what is true is that the harm on Guam is real, it's not hypothetical, and it deeply affects real people that live here. We won the case at the trial court, but the US is fighting us every step of the way. Thank you. I look forward to any questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Jacobs. I thank again, Mr. Jacob, thank the panel for the testimonies. And so now, next we will go to questions. Committee Rule 3D imposes or sets a 5-minute limit on questions. And I would like to now recognize Chairman Grijalva for any question he may wish to ask the witnesses. Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank the ranking member for the courtesy. Let me begin with my former colleague, and friend, and it's good to see her again, Dr. Christensen. Thanks for being here. You've been a fierce advocate for expanded Medicaid program to U.S. territory. You have also, I might say, we're at the forefront of bringing the tri-caucus together to begin to deal with the fundamental issue that continues to haunt us of disparities in health delivery and health attention and health prevention and treatment in this country with regards to communities of color and poor people. And for that, I'm forever grateful. The one conference that you had that I attended was eye-opening, and I learned so much, and it's continued to be a very critical and important issue, and I want to thank you for that. Can you talk about the importance that President Biden called for parity for territories going into the future as part of his public pronouncements during and after the campaign? Could you comment on that and what it means?
Sure. Well, thank you for the question, and I'm sorry for running over on my testimony. It's the president's words have great significance, and budgets are a testimony to our ethics, our moral, and our aspirations for the future. So the president, having said that, at least begins to set in motion the process to get to parity for territories. Congress still has a lot of work to do, but the president, as the leader of this country, saying very clearly that we must have parity in at least these three programs, which opens the door to make sure that all of our programs, the territories, have parity in, is extremely important, and it sets the ball in motion to get there. And we just have to make sure it happens.
Thank you very much. And there's memory amnesia sometimes, history amnesia that hits members of Congress when now it's anything that happens now or does is all it's Biden's fault, the Biden administration's fault. No appreciation for history and no appreciation for the fact that this festering problem has been with us for quite a long time, and certainly festered even more in the last 4 years. But beyond that, thank you, Doctor. Ms. Solomon, I thank the Center for continued research on Medicaid programs in the territories. Talk about why Congress shouldn't miss this opportunity to deliver on the president's call for parity. Energy Commerce Committee approved a bipartisan bill earlier this month with a temporary solution. Many of us here today, Mr. Sablan, myself, and the witnesses would like to see that codified as a permanent issue, but we have this temporary solution. Can you react as to the opportunity before Congress to do something?
Yes, I think this is in some ways a historic opportunity to set a course for parity. While the bill approved by Energy and Commerce is very significant and will avoid the cliff, it eventually will end up where we started. Without the promise of open-ended funding that adjusts to need and a match rate that recognizes the financial capacity of the territories to contribute, they never will be able to bring their programs up to the same level as the states, and will just be continuing in this cycle, leaving people in the territories. We don't want to forget about the people in the territories in a state of uncertainty.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Jacob, first of all, let me thank you for the fights in court on behalf of the residents residing in Guam and other U.S. territories that are completely excluded from SSI. We don't need to go into the benefits to individuals. We don't need to go into that. I'm just, I think the point that you made today in your testimony, Mr. Jacobs, kind of, brings the urgency of a legislative fix to SSI, given where it is or where it isn't in the court in terms of interpretation of that. We're talking about real people, as you said, and talk about a legislative fix, and given the Justice Department position, I'm very, very disappointed that they continued that position of opposition to that extension of parity under SSI to the territory, Guam in particular. Could you comment on the Justice Department position?
Thank you, Chairman Grijalva, for those reflections. I would just like to add to really sink the point to this very important committee, that this is a harm that is not hypothetical. It is real.
Good point.
When we heard the saga in the Valle Madera case by Governor Fortuno, that circumstance where the SSA has gone after people who have returned home to their islands and received benefits to claw back that money, people that were beneficiaries and need those funds and otherwise qualify, is really, really unjust. And it is not consistent with our American principles of justice, morality,
Thank you.
and care for vulnerable people.
Thank you very much, Ms. Sablan. Yield back, and thank you for your leadership on this. And thank you and the ranking member for the hearing.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd now like to recognize Ms. Gonzalez Colon. Ms. Colon, you have 5 minutes, please.
Yeah, keep on it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate all the witnesses for being with us today. And now I'd like to make my first question to Governor Fortuno. And the reason I'm doing this, not just because you were a member of Congress and you dealt with many of these issues before, but at the same time, you managed the Medicare on the island while you were governor. And I think it's important to the record to show what are some of the health services Puerto Rico is currently unable to cover because of the insufficient medical funding.
Certainly, Congresswoman Gonzalez Colon, thank you for the question. Indeed, there are 7 out of the 17 Medicaid required benefits that are not available in Puerto Rico right now. That includes adult immunizations, non-emergency medical transportation, nursing homes, and home health care services, among others. And this affects actually mostly the most vulnerable and seniors among us. I would say that all of this is causing a lack of certainty due to insufficient funding. On the Medicaid side, it's about 60% below the U.S. average. On the Medicare side, it's about 41% below. And there's a condition there where among other things, on Medicare you don't have automatic enrollment in Part B, which means 4 times as many U.S. citizens in Puerto Rico actually are Part A only beneficiaries. That's unheard of. No Part D low-income subsidy, no DISH or disproportionate share hospital formula, and no Medicare savings program, among others. So in both programs, there are significant disparities.
You just mentioned a few of the programs that are not available on the island, and Medicaid is not the only federal health program affected by the territorial status for all of us. In the case of Puerto Rico, what other disparities in treatment of territorial federal programs affect the healthcare system on the island? You mentioned Part B, you mentioned a low-income subsidy, but there's also in terms of the medical advantage penetration on the island, the lower Medicaid reimbursements. What else is not included or is affecting the healthcare of the island? Is Governor Fortuno there? You're mute.
I'm sorry. Yes, I'm sorry. Actually, insufficient funding for both programs, Medicaid on the one hand and Medicare on the other hand. And the second case, even though residents of the island actually get the same deduction to pay for Medicare than those residents in the U.S. mainland. It's affecting close to 80% of the population. And the end result has been that, for example, the Part B is an important one because you don't have access to certain services that otherwise you would have. The low income, the Part D low income subsidy for medications is another one, and then you end up having a situation where the MA programs, which in the case of Puerto Rico have the highest penetration rate in the country, actually are being forced to cover some of these services at the expense of other services that should be received by those seniors and are not being received. And again, the most vulnerable, especially seniors of low income levels, are those that are going to be affected by this.
What are the implications of this inequitable treatment under Medicaid and other federal healthcare programs for medical providers on islands? Can you discuss, has this contributed to the exodus of doctors and providers?
Indeed, actually, we have a situation where we have a significant exodus of not just medical doctors, specialists and subspecialists, but also medical technicians, nurses, and so on and so forth. So this has actually created a condition where sometimes there are one or two only subspecialists in the whole island to cover 3.2 million American citizens.
How do you think the long-standing unequal treatment under Medicaid program and the fact that we're facing a cliff every couple of years impacts the government ability to budget and modernize the healthcare system?
Well, not just the government, but also the private sector, the hospitals. How can they plan moving forward? It's impossible. And on top of that, this situation has been compounded by the Oversight Board, which actually in its projections forces the state government to actually into a fourth crisis unnecessarily, assuming that there won't be any supplemental Medicaid funding when there has been every year for the last decade or so. So it's very difficult for responsible budget planning and prioritization becomes extremely difficult, if not impossible, under those circumstances.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Time's up. Ms. Gonzalez, you yield back?
Definitely. Do I still have time?
No, you don't. Thank you.
I yield back.
All right. I know, let me, look, we check with the rules. The rules of the committee allows that a witness may, even though she's not on the video, but if she could hear the question and respond to the question, that she could respond. Let me ask, Congresswoman Sablan, Christina, can you hear me?
Yes, sir. I'm here. I'm on the
All
phone.
right, and I can hear you. Okay. I yield myself 5 minutes for questioning. Congresswoman, one of the arguments currently being used against the full implementation of SNAP in the Marianas is that the administrative costs to run the program and the required investments to set up the necessary systems to meet full program compliance. So if the 50 states, District of Columbia, U.S. Virgin Islands, and of course our neighbor territory of Guam can set up and run successful programs, I don't see why our Commonwealth government cannot. So what do you say to this argument that due to some cost and burden, running SNAP in the Marianas is just not practical?
Thank you, Congressman. I am quite familiar with that argument. It's this notion that full parity is not possible for the territories, for the Marianas in particular, with respect to SNAP, because full compliance is just too complicated, too expensive. And while it's true that full compliance with the program integrity requirements will require significant investment in infrastructure and systems and people, and while we will have challenges, our lack of compliance right now is not indicative of inability to comply, but I think it points more to the inadequacy of investment thus far to build the system and institutions that are necessary to reach compliance.
All right, so I agree with you, but besides the 3 social welfare programs highlighted today, for example, what programs, if provided full parity and funding, do you think would provide the most benefit to residents in the Marianas? Say you were a member of Congress, what program would you think would be also most beneficial to residents in the Marianas?
Sure. Well, I think temporary assistance for needy families would be a good start. Another in the area of healthcare, our hospital, although it does serve a significant number of low-income patients who do not have access to health insurance and cannot pay for their care, and our hospital is located in a rural area, it does not qualify for the disproportionate share hospital designation or the critical access hospital designation that would protect the hospital from further financial vulnerability. It doesn't qualify for these extra payments. I think that could make a huge difference for.
All right, thank you. Yeah, thank you. And I want to thank you also for your bill that removed the 100% tax on EITC benefits for our people. Thank you very much for that. Dr. Christensen, thank you for your informative testimony. Of course, I often remind my colleagues that denying full program funding to the territories does not provide the savings to federal budget, because quite often our constituents wind up relocating to Hawaii, Florida, or other states where they would receive their full benefits. So, but can you remind us, please, of what occurred during the development of the healthcare reform when House delegates agreed to receive state-like treatment in exchange for our support, only to be told later that we couldn't insist on this agreement because it would jeopardize passage of the ACA bill?
Well, I just remember that the Medicaid issue was one of the hardest issues to get agreement on. As I said in my written testimony, the Senate had wanted to just give us a 30% increase, and really the White House had not had a position on Medicaid. And it was, as I understand it, the very last issue that was resolved in the negotiations for the ACA. It happened with the Hispanic caucus, and it was because one of the issues could not be resolved, one that would provide some coverage for undocumented residents of the United States, that they finally agreed to give us what we did get. It's always a question of funding, but we are American citizens and we are entitled to be treated like American citizens everywhere else in the country. So funding should not be an issue. It's not an issue in Mississippi. It's not an issue in New York. It should not be an issue in the territories. But it was the last thing that really was decided on.
Thank you, Donna. I need to stay within my time, but I do remember that. I do remember that meeting at the White House. I was there when that thing came up. I'm on time, so I now recognize Ms. Radeweiser. Ms. Radeweiser, you have something.
Thank you, Chairman Sablan, Ranking Member Gonzalez Colon, as well as Chairman Grijalva, Ranking Member Westerman, for holding this hearing today. Thank you to the panel for your testimony. I don't have any questions for the witnesses, but I do wish to align myself with their concerns and say a few things on this issue. Parity for social programs in the United States territories has long been something worth fighting for. As we've heard in the testimonies given today, the Americans of the U.S. territories are at a distinct disadvantage when it comes to our social safety net. Further exacerbating this are our remote locations and delicate economic circumstances. For example, my home district of American Samoa is the most remote inhabited territory in the United States, without the benefit of being close to a major trading center or any military bases. Our nearest neighbor is New Zealand, still over a 5-hour flight away. These programs are essential to maintain the health of my islands, and even still we struggle. Due to the inconsistent structure of these programs across the territories, we find ourselves in a situation where those who are most likely to need these programs are often the least likely to benefit from them. I don't think this was the intent when these programs were created, but it still falls on us to make the necessary adjustments for equitable treatment. Now, to be fair, parity for these programs won't automatically fix all our problems. The underlying economic struggles faced by the territories will still exist and will need to be addressed in turn, but don't let it be said that we allowed the complexity of a problem to stop us from making much needed changes. Expanding these programs will allow us the breathing room necessary to focus on addressing other areas of insecurity. The expansion of these programs would increase the economic health of American Samoa and all the territories. Better economic health means better economic growth. With all that, I have to say I'm pleased that this issue has gotten more and more attention lately. The Energy and Commerce Committee recently passed a territorial Medicaid extension out of markup last week, and my fellow territorial members and I participated in a roundtable graciously hosted by Rules Committee Chairman McGovern, which included SNAP and other food security benefits as a major topic. And finally, of course, we're holding this hearing today to discuss Medicaid, SSI, and SNAP parity. So overall, I'm optimistic that we're moving in the right direction. I hope this discussion and those like it will serve as a jumping off point for action and real change from other relevant committees and Congress as a whole. To conclude, I want to align myself with my territorial colleagues in our push for fairer treatment, and I look forward to working with everyone here towards improving these social programs, not just for us, but for the entire country. At the end of the day, these types of programs are about reaching out to those who need it most. The desire to help people is why many of us are in Congress today, even if we rarely agree on the details. Everyone is here because they care deeply about the American people. And as long as we keep that shared desire to help in mind, we'll continue to build up and maintain the greatest country in the world. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Radowagon. I now would like, if she has any questions, I'd like to recognize Ms. Napolitano. Grace? Going once, going twice. Let me now recognize Mr. San Nicolas, please. Mike, you have 5 minutes, please.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I want to begin by thanking my fellow Guam witness, Attorney Jacob, for his very well-delivered testimony at 4 o'clock, 3:30 in the morning, Guam time. Thank you so much, sir, for making the effort and for doing it with such grace. I'd like to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your leadership in putting together this discussion. This is a discussion that needs to be had and needs to be had regularly. I would like to take a moment to recognize our fellow colleague, Congressman Soto, who I believe briefly joined us and may still be with us in this particular hearing, for his leadership in moving forward the Medicaid extension in the Energy and Commerce Committee. And I would like to thank all of our colleagues who have helped to co-sponsor that, advocate for that, and help us to get unanimous consent on that. That's been a bipartisan effort, and I know that we've been working together on both sides of the aisle, my fellow colleagues, on this hearing to make that move forward. I'm hopeful that the unanimous nature of that extension advancing is indicative of a potential unanimous consent for us going into the full House. And again, that momentum carrying us through the Senate and beyond. And that being said, Mr. Chairman, if we are able to secure that, which I'm optimistic that we are, and while it isn't full parity, it does buy us some time. And I wanted to talk about that from two perspectives. The first is, of course, buying that time is absolutely worthwhile, but it means that we're going to come full circle at some point in the future. And in my short time here in the Congress, as we've been working the issues to try and advocate for SNAP parity for CNMI, and SSI parity for our remaining territories, one of the conversations that constantly comes up is, oh, well, we're working on your Medicaid right now. And while that work is appreciated, it's work that's going to continue to be ongoing into the future. And if we're constantly going to be putting our other parity issues on the back burner because we keep circling around the same issue over and over again, then we're being put on a territorial merry-go-round while the rest of the country continues to advance. As we begin discussing reconciliation, I'm hopeful that our colleagues will recognize the fact that this is a serious window for us to put SNAP for CNMI and SSI for our territories directly into the language so that we can close those loops while we advance our Medicaid initiative with the bill that is being moved forward from the Energy and Commerce Committee. And I know, Mr. Chairman, you've been providing leadership on many of these issues very robustly, and I wanted to again recognize you for always being a fortress for the territories in trying to secure these parity items. I wanted to talk about the future, and I wanted to kind of put this question to my Guam witness, Mr. Jacob. Assuming the worst case scenario that our court cases are unsuccessful, and assuming the tragic scenario that we are unable to get reconciliation for supplemental security income for our territories, what does that mean for future generations on Guam, and particularly for our communities that continue to age?
Thank you, Congressman San Nicolas, and thank you for that really important question following the advocacy that you made for us out here on Guam. It means an enormous deal. It's a big deal if the Congress, or if Congress does not give us parity in SSI and we lose in the court case, we're back to the same old situation. The case I just talked about, Leslie and Katrina will probably never see each other again. Katrina will probably will have lost the fight she fought so hard for families, not just on Guam, but around the country that want to reunite. We have people from Guam that have moved to the CNMI and other places to get these benefits. It has split families up. Concretely, we put this information in front of the district court. We have the block grant for ABD. We have 550 Romanians that take advantage of that at $167 a month. 550, when our legislature has said the number is 24,000 that would otherwise be eligible for SSI. That's a big deal. Thank you. I know the time is up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, Mr. Jacobs, it is indeed a sad story for those young lady, woman, the young child. And I also be remiss if I don't associate. I recognize that this package that we're moving forward. Mr. Soto just joined us, but the package that we're moving forward, I also need to acknowledge the work of our resident commissioner and Mrs. Bradewagon in getting their side of the aisle to agree to the increased amount of Medicaid money. So that work is very well taken. Thank you, Jennifer and Amata. I now recognize Mr. Tiffany Mr. Tiffany. His room is there, but Mr. Tiffany going once, Mr. Tiffany going twice. I'd like to recognize, I go to Grace Napolitano. Ms. Napolitano, you're recognized for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Gregorio. It's a wonder. I've been 23 years on natural resources, and there have repeatedly heard the same stories about the territories not getting the same treatment. And it's about time, but let's quit talking about it. Let's take some action. And I'm glad that all of you are on there. We need to make sure that everybody understands the plight your territories are going through. It isn't changing anything if they keep talking about it. Get all the agencies together and get them to focus on what they should be doing. It's just talk is not going to get it done. I just congratulate and I agree with San Nicolas over that item that you mentioned. It is a terrible thing to have people actually being hurt because we cannot cover them with the services the rest of the nation enjoys. So I thank you very much. You're doing a great job, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Napolitano. I now need to recognize Mr. Stauber. Mr. Stauber, sir, you have 5 minutes, please.
Thank you. Appreciate this opportunity. Is Mr. Solomon on? Okay, Ms. Solomon, rather. I want to thank you for joining us today.
Mr. Stauber, would you yield for, hold on. Oh, thank you. Now you have the clock timer. Please continue.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Ms. Solomon, thank you for joining us today. And, you know, a quick read of the Ways and Means Committee's jurisdiction and rules page shows that Social Security is under their jurisdiction. Another quick glance of the Nutrition, Oversight and Department Operations Subcommittee in the House Agricultural Committee's website shows that it has SNAP jurisdiction. When I read the House Natural Resources Committee's website, I find no mention of SNAP, SSI, or Medicaid. As an expert on congressional action on these topics, why are none of these programs listed under our jurisdiction when we are holding a hearing on it today?
Now,
I'm afraid I'm not the right one to answer that question,
yeah,
I think.
Mr. Stauber, you are correct. You are very correct. But at the same time, Mr. Stauber, the jurisdiction, the Natural Resources Committee's jurisdiction includes all of the insular areas, the 5 insular areas. And as a matter of fact, it includes Wake Island and Midway and Johnston Atoll. So we have we have jurisdiction over issues that affect residents of the insular areas and other possessions, sir.
Mr. Chair.
Yes.
I'm not sure, I'm not sure if I agree with it. That's why I don't find any of it under this committee's jurisdiction, SNAP,
Oversight.
SSI, or Medicaid. It's not even mentioned that I can see.
Not legislating.
No, but see, the holding this hearing, we're not legislating anything. We just have oversight responsibility. We have oversight jurisdiction over the insular areas. And so, which is why we're having this hearing, just as we have had many hearings in the past over issues that affect the Americans that live in the in the territory. It often brings awareness to other communities, that as is happened in the last Congress. And
well, Mr. Chair, if I may,
yes, please. Yes,
I understand they're important issues. I'm just debating whether this committee has jurisdiction. So with that, Mr. Chair, I'd like to yield the rest of my time to Representative Gonzalez-Colon, please.
Absolutely, Ms. Gonzalez-Colon. If you have,
yes. Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Stauber. And Stauber brings a correct issue. This committee cannot legislate on issues of SNAP or Medicaid or many of the other issues. Right now, Energy and Commerce is doing so in the bill that Congressman Soto and Billy Rakis just did last week. They approved it, and we are endorsing that bill. We are working through the Agriculture Committee as well for the issues of SNAP and many others that are in Ways and Means. So you are completely correct. The committee cannot legislate on none of these issues. Having said that, I appreciate you yielding, and I will take the time to ask a question to Governor Fortuno. And that will be in terms of, you're talking about the PROMESA board, the oversight board that was legislated actually by this committee.
Sure.
Having, Mr. Chairman, I think you got the mic open, thank you. So when the oversight board needs to do the budget for every year, it literally limits the way the government of Puerto Rico can manage the budget, because until there's money approved by Congress, additional funding for Medicaid, the governor cannot use the rest of the funds. So that said, it creates a big burden in the finances of the island. Can you explain that?
Sure, and thank you again for the question and the opportunity. Indeed, this situation is creating an environment that does not lend itself to responsible budget planning and prioritization, and it becomes very difficult for the state government to plan accordingly because the projections put forth by the Oversight Board as it pertains to the Medicaid funding assume that there will be no supplemental funding, even though Congress has approved supplemental funding for the last decade.
Having said that, how do you make a reconciliation in terms of increasing access to social benefits and fiscal responsibility?
Well, again, what you're having here is a requirement by the state government to take over responsibilities that normally are covered by a federal program, and it just makes it very, very difficult for the state government to make projections and budget accordingly. That's an issue, and I strongly believe in responsible budgeting. It's become very, very difficult.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, thank you. I now is Mr. Stansberry with us? I don't see a video with Mr. Stansberry. All right, Mr. Stansberry going once. Gone. I now recognize Mr. Soto. Darren was here just a minute ago. Very slippery. Mr. Soto. Okay, going once and gone. Now Mr. Chue, Sus Chue Garcia. Mr. Garcia, Sus, he's right there. There you are. You have 5 minutes, sir. Yes.
He's on mute.
Yeah. Congressman Garcia, you have questions? I recognize you for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right.
Sablan, and to the ranking member. Even before the pandemic, Puerto Rico, like other territories, suffered from decades of underinvestment and a shortchanged healthcare system. Puerto Rico is poorer than the poorest state, nearly half of its population relying on Medicaid. Yet, Puerto Rico gets limited spending cap for the program. What does this mean for the people on the island? It means that possibly losing health coverage in the middle of a pandemic. President Biden's 2022 budget will take a crucial step toward giving residents of U.S. territories equal access to the nation's safety net. And this Democratic Congress needs to help him keep his promise for full Medicaid funding for Puerto Rico. This committee can start by passing the bill that my colleague, Congresswoman Velasquez, and Senator Sanders, that would provide equal funding for Puerto Rico under Medicaid, SNAP, and SSI. This call for parity represents a historic opportunity to do what is right and end the second-class treatment that has exacerbated social and economic inequities. A question for the Honorable Luis Fortuno. Parity for federal programs in Puerto Rico has been a long-term goal. Why is now the best time to implement parity once and for all, and what would be the consequences if it didn't happen?
Thank you, Congressman Garcia. It's a pleasure again, and thank you for the question. Well, I believe that the parity should have always been there as part of the all these programs, and it was mentioned before in this hearing that since we are all American citizens, we can go back and forth between the U.S. mainland and the territories. So there's really no savings for the federal government in not allowing parity in these programs. That's number one. Number two, in a number of these programs, actually, the residents of the territories are contributing just like our fellow citizens across the rest of the nation. So it is strongly unfair not to allow them to participate just for reason of residency. Thirdly, and I mentioned the 225,000 plus veterans from Puerto Rico, but I know there are thousands in the other territories as well, many of them that have actually given up their lives in defense of freedom and democracy. How can we deny to them and their families these programs? So hopefully it will happen now, but whether it's now or should have happened long before, and this has been a fight. And I know that of every member that has of Congress that has represented, in the case of Puerto Rico, the island, and I know in the other territories as well. And we hope that this will happen sometime soon.
Yes, sir. And thank you for that. In your view, did the government of Puerto Rico adequately push for enough Medicaid funding for the island?
Yes, actually, I have seen the report that was put together by the government of Puerto Rico and actually circulated also by Congressman Gonzalez. I believe it was put together by Deloitte, and it was full parity. But you know, I think it was former member Donna Christensen that I remember. I was serving at the same time when ACA was approved. That you know, it has been the history of all of these territories. We normally end up, you know, having receiving less than full parity. However, I would say, and I am thankful not just to Congressman Gonzalez, but to Congressman Soto, Billy Rakis, and the others that are working on a bipartisan solution. And you know, many of them, and I see Mr. Soto now, Mr. Sablan, I see Mr. Soto. He, together with Congressman Gonzalez, have been leaders, and I'm thankful to both of them.
And sir, in an email that I saw that you sent to your clients earlier this month, it sounds like you were only pushing for a 4-year extension of Medicaid funding for the island beyond current levels. Do you feel that this is sufficient to cover the island's needs, and would you define this as parity for Puerto Rico?
Mr. Garcia, with all due respect, the one client that I represent has always been supportive of full parity for the island. And this is not an issue that lends itself to partisan politics, and anyone that wants to do politics with it should be ashamed of himself.
Thank you very much. No further questions, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Garcia. No, Mr. Blake, sir, you have 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. I've got a bunch of questions about how we can, what we need to be doing to be thinking about growing the economy and sustaining living wages and jobs. I'd rather talk about that. It's my understanding that this is under the Committee of Jurisdiction, is under Energy and Commerce on what's going on. There's bipartisan work going on, whether or not these entitlement programs can be addressed. We've had good substantive conversations with our insular areas and our territories on what we need to do to ensure they have reliable energy. So candidly, that's the kind of conversation I'd love to have. I'm going to direct some questions to Governor Fortuno, but I mean, at this point, this is the part I think we should be focusing on, is what is going to actually make sustainable living wages for our fellow Americans living in these areas. This is the key. Otherwise, it's a never-ending cycle, right? And I want to make sure that that's the focus and for what we need to actually be doing. Governor Fortuno, addressing economic disparities between the mainland and our insular areas. You know, we've grappled with this as a nation for years. Given your personal experiences, can you speak to what sorts of creative policies we could pursue here in Washington that could help jumpstart our insular economies so that, again, the purpose is to make more people financially independent? That's what we want to do. Like, any ideas? What can we actually do in Washington to help this?
Congressman Moore, I thank you for a very constructive comment and certainly your question. And indeed, pro-growth policies across the territories could be very helpful in generating jobs. What we need are jobs. And most people, when they actually move away from the territories and move to the U.S. mainland, they're looking for jobs, job opportunities, better education for their children, security. Those are the bread and butter issues that actually make us parents move one way or another. And that's exactly what we need. So I again, there should be, I believe, full parity in these programs, but also full opportunities for economic development. And that requires infrastructure, requires proper tax policies, and so on and so forth.
Excellent. Thank you. You actually hit on the point that I wanted to make next too. And maybe you can explain a little bit about the effects of immigration, folks leaving these areas for mainland in search of jobs. Like what kind of effect does that have on poverty rates and the capacity for economic expansion? Can you just kind of maybe educate us a little bit on that?
Well, oftentimes when that exodus occurs, you actually are losing the youngest, better educated, best and the brightest that you want, productive people that you want to remain on the island. I've always often said that my goal is for our children and grandchildren to yearn to stay in Puerto Rico and to generate economic activity in Puerto Rico, because that's the only way that the local economy will be sustainable.
In best opportunities, I come from the state of Utah, and one of the most unique things about the state of Utah is that when there's an economic downturn in our country, we largely track similarly to the U.S. So we have a very diverse economy. My district alone, manufacturing, agriculture, defense, tourism, energy production. It's so vast, and it's why Utah has the nation's strongest economy. That's why we have 2% unemployment. That's why we don't have, so many issues that require so many type of entitlement discussions that we have. Like, what can we do for these in the insular areas? What opportunities are there for investment, growth? Are there specific industries that need to be addressed? Is tourism, is there work being done on tourism to make it better? Obviously, the pandemic's been tough there. Just any thought, I'd love your thoughts on that for what you see as a vision on economic diversification.
Well, you're right on point on what's required in a diversified, sustainable economy. And in that sense, I would say that in the case of Puerto Rico specifically, tourism is certainly one area that lends itself for further growth. Manufacturing, we have had a strong manufacturing sector as well. The export of services. And I would say you need a better integration into national policies that promote and generate jobs. We don't want handouts. We want jobs. We want opportunity. And that's what we yearn for.
Governor, thank you so much. My time is up, and you've got a really productive points that you're making. And to the rest of the team, to the rest of the committee, that's my intent too, is to be productive in this. This is something that I strongly care about, and see it benefit my own state to have a diverse economic opportunity. That's what we need. So thank you all. I yield back.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Moore. Now let me recognize Mr. Soto. Fine, Darren, you have 5 minutes, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. We all know that Puerto Rico is home to 3.2 million Americans, and it's got a bigger population than half the states. Generations have served in our military, pledged allegiance to our flag, and paid many types of federal taxes. Since Puerto Rico is not a state, they, along with other territories, are not treated equally in areas such as healthcare, like Medicaid, food assistance like NAP, and Social Security benefits like SSI. In the greatest democracy in the history of the world, there are still many Americans in their territories that face inequality. The good news is that Congress is taking this seriously. Territories were treated equal under the American Rescue Plan, which has been huge to help all of them recover like Americans on the mainland in states. We also saw a bipartisan support, unanimous support in the Energy and Commerce Committee for my bill with Representative Gus Bilirakis, the Supporting Medicaid and U.S. Territories Act of 2021, extending Puerto Rico's Medicaid program equal funding for 5 years and 8 years for funding for other U.S. territories. And the reason for that is Puerto Rico is so much bigger, it's so much more expensive. In order for us to get a bipartisan solution, we had to compromise at 5 years, just so everybody was wondering. So there was a lot of discussion about the Energy and Commerce Committee having jurisdiction over a lot of the legislation here. We have several members who are on that committee that are on this committee, including Representative Tonko, who I see shaking his head as well. this committee still has oversight over all the territories. So it's wholly appropriate for us to talk about these inequities in this committee, just so we're clear. Even if we can't legislate, other committees are listening, and we are acting in concert with the Natural Resources Committee. So it'd be great, Governor Fortuno, for you to speak a little bit about what are the long-term effects on jobs and the economy for instability in the Medicaid program, in the NAP program, and in SSI? How does it affect the economy and jobs in the private sector?
Congressman Soto, again, thank you for your leadership in this issue and other issues that you that teaming together with our Congresswoman Gonzalez, and we thank you for, on behalf of all the 3.2 million American citizens residing in Puerto Rico. The effect is actually multifaceted. Number one, it's impossible to plan, because if you are dependent on actually stopgap funding for Medicaid, even in the case of Medicare, it varies from year to year as well. Hospitals, medical providers, physicians, small clinics, it is impossible for them to plan accordingly. Thus, it's very difficult to make the necessary investments in the medical equipment to provide that world-class healthcare services. That's number one. Number two, then if you want to expand an area in your hospital, clinic, or office, it's very difficult to plan as well, even to hire people, because you don't know if next year the funding will be there. And actually, it again creates tremendous uncertainty. Same thing happens with the nutritional program. All the distribution chain that is involved in that actually area, it cannot plan accordingly because they don't know how much funding will be available the next year. And that generates not just uncertainty, but a situation where you may be assuming or projecting for the next few years what the economic situation will be, and it could change from one year to the next. And certainly on SSI, it's an area that I believe it's just a civil rights issue, and that's why it's before the U.S. Supreme Court.
Sure. I want to drill down to agriculture. We know more than half the Puerto Rico economy is manufacturing. There's an important tourism industry, but a lot of folks think agriculture could be increased to help build more private sector jobs. How important is the NAP program to boosting that agriculture industry in Puerto Rico?
It's key, and actually, we could actually generate additional economic activity, especially in the rural areas. But if we had not just additional funding, but more certainty in the program as well, because it's very difficult to plan accordingly and make the necessary investments in your agriculture and infrastructure to run your business. I am a strong believer that actually this could generate not just thousands of jobs in Puerto Rico, but across the nation as well.
Sure. And just to close, these are private sector healthcare jobs. These are private sector agriculture jobs that are being supported with a foundation of these federal programs that states already have. So it's really important to note that this is helping the private sector economy in addition to providing key benefits to Americans who are unequal in our territories. And I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Soto. Thank you very much. I now recognize Mr. Benz. Sir, you have 5 minutes, please.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and Governor, thank you for your willingness to answer these difficult questions. According to a study carried out by the Food and Nutrition Service at USDA, implementing SNAP in Puerto Rico would, quote, raise Puerto Rico's administrative costs by an additional 18.1 million, or 5% of the total cost increase, end quote. As former governor of Puerto Rico, do you believe Puerto Rico has the resources to support a SNAP transition?
Congressman Benz, thank you for that question. That's a very important question, I believe, in the discussion of SNAP. And I believe, yes, it will have the capacity. Just the new economic activity generated by the additional funding and the transitioning into SNAP will generate not just jobs, but actually new tax revenues that will more than cover the $18 million that were calculated.
The second question, under the current nutrition assistance program in Puerto Rico, 25% of the benefits can apparently be redeemed for cash. If the island switched to SNAP, that would no longer be allowed. Do you think the residents of Puerto Rico would support this?
Yes, I believe so. And actually, there's a reason for that. Uh, since the program is truncated, it's limited. Especially in the rural areas, there are a good number of businesses that may not have the technological capability to handle the EBT cards. However, if this program is more certainty is provided to this program and additional funding, I have no doubts that even the smallest of these businesses in the rural areas would make the investment.
Right, but the question is, if the residents are currently accustomed to being able to use your current program to generate cash, and the new program taking its place doesn't, what do they do without that money, or is that money not that big a deal to them as things are currently structured?
No, it is important, but more important is to have food security and have a balanced, adequate nutrition. And this will guarantee, this transition will certainly guarantee that that is the case, not just for current beneficiaries, but for the additional beneficiaries that are working poor, but that today do not qualify for the program under the current conditions.
Yeah. Thank you, Governor. And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Benz. Now I recognize I did for a long time see Mr. Case. Mr. Case was here. Mr. Case, going once. Mr. Tonko, you have 5 minutes, sir, please.
Hey, thank you, Chairman Sablan. Thank you so much. And as Representative Soto indicated, I'm one of those individuals who serves both on energy and commerce and natural resources. So very interested in the dialogue today and the discussion. And I thank you for holding this hearing on achieving parity for federal programs in U.S. territories. The COVID-19 pandemic has provided opportunities to identify and fix gaps in safety net programs. And that work is not done until the American citizens living in U.S. territories have equal access to these critical federal programs. So, Representative Sablan, territories like the Northern Marianas and Puerto Rico are already seeing the impacts of climate change, such as the 2015 and 2018 typhoons that you mentioned in your testimony. We know that rising temperatures can have severe impacts on human health, especially for the elderly and the most vulnerable. How do programs like Medicaid and SSI and even SNAP help protect residents of the territories from natural disasters and the effects of climate change?
Thank you for that question. Super Typhoon U2 in 2018 was a huge wake-up call for all of us. In the Marianas, we are accustomed to typhoons, but U2 was like nothing we'd ever seen before. The worst of my lifetime, certainly, the strongest on Earth that year, and one of the most destructive on record in U.S. history. And right before that, we had just 3 years before U2, we had experienced another catastrophic typhoon, Typhoon Sotalor. And what was frightening for many of us here was that experts warned us to prepare for more storms like that, of that severity and with greater frequency as a consequence of climate change. So programs like Medicaid, SSI, and SNAP, they provide safety nets for vulnerable Americans, and there is really no more time when you feel vulnerable than after disaster. And these safety nets really help people to get to the other side of disaster or a pandemic or illness or any economic adversity, and really provides the tools and the security to rebuild from there and rebuild stronger and more resilient for the future.
Well, I thank you for that information. And how does a threat like climate crisis affect the urgency of achieving parity for our territories?
Well, climate change makes the threat of more severe and more extreme storms, they're just more common. We can expect them to happen again. We need to be prepared for them. Parity in these programs that provide security for people who are the most vulnerable in our communities, that will go a long way towards helping us prepare for these future events. Would help a lot. And now is the time. There is momentum. There is interest in correcting these structural inequities that we see in all different federal programs. Parity for the territories has been a long-standing issue, and we should seize this opportunity now and make permanent fixes to the problems that we've been dealing with for so many years.
Yeah. Well, wonderful. And Ms. Solomon, in your testimony, you talk about the instability of the current Medicaid block grant system that relies on short-term legislative fixes to avoid frequent funding cliffs. Can you tell us more about how this system affects Medicaid in the territories and why the stability brought by Parity is so critical to the American citizens who rely on these services?
Thank you for the question. We've had all these cliffs and Congress always steps in, but it's really hard to run a program like that. We've seen that in the case of Puerto Rico, where with the 2-year funding, they had enough money to make some improvements, including raising reimbursement rates and expanding eligibility. They had to get permission of the Oversight Board to do that. And while they agreed, they basically said, you have to cut this off on September 30th. So now they're in the position of not knowing what's going to happen and whether, 150,000 or so people who became eligible under the higher standards could lose coverage. I think Governor Fortuno mentioned the investments that are needed by providers and others. It's parity means lifting the standards, but it also means providing stability for the program going forward and making sure it can meet the needs, on your last question on climate change, as they experience these disasters, you need to have the program flexible enough to meet the need when it increases.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Tonko. Mr. Lip, thank you for your patience. Rashida, you have 5 minutes, please.
Thank you so much, Chairman, and I really appreciate this hearing, especially because we're talking about really unacceptable disparities in social service spending for our neighbors in the United States territories. My question is to you, Representative Sablan. I want to highlight the human impact of these funding disparities because sometimes we get to talk about the numbers, but forget really to talk about the people behind it. And I know some colleagues talked about poverty and so forth, but if you can, Representative Sablan, if you can set the stage for me and my colleagues who maybe aren't so familiar with the Northern Marina Islands that you represent, can you talk about the economic struggles many of your residents are facing right now?
Sure. Thank you, Congressman, for that question. So in the Northern Marianas has been in recovery since at least 2015 from multiple major catastrophic storms. And before that, there were all these, and now, of course, we're in the middle of this pandemic, and the economy is basically at a standstill. But what COVID-19 has done is really expose these underlying vulnerabilities and these economic struggles that we've been dealing with in the Marianas for a very long time, and presented opportunities, we hope, to really correct in a permanent and lasting way the structural inequities that have been affecting the Marianas as well as our sister territories. We know what it's like to fall off these fiscal cliffs. In very recent history, in 2019, our Medicaid program ran out of money, and we had to come back to Congress. We've had to come back to Congress multiple times to respond to disasters and provide more funding for these programs that people really needed after a super typhoon. The whole island was devastated, and then there was no money for Medicaid halfway through the fiscal year. In 2020, in the middle of a pandemic, the governor slashed food aid to thousands of families, and we had to come back to Congress for funding for that program as well. And so, there are really dire impacts for people, the most vulnerable people in our communities are just driven deeper into poverty and instability when there are these disparities.
No, and I know
program-
how it can really create generational trauma as well. You know, I did appreciate, Representative, that you highlighted veteran issues in your testimony. My office gets large portion of our resident casework are from our veterans in need of critical services. I mean, can you talk about the unequal treatment from the VA to our Northern Marianas, you know, veterans?
Yes, absolutely. And the Northern Marianas is really the only jurisdiction in the nation that lacks really basic access points for VA care. We don't have a community-based outpatient clinic. There really is no VA doctor. There's no vet center. And even just by virtue of where they live, the family caregivers of our veterans don't qualify for VA caregiver benefits because the VA doesn't provide the services, the basic services that would be required to administer the caregiver support program. And, you know, veterans in the Marianas, like veterans throughout the territories, have to get on a plane and travel many hours, in many cases, to access the VA care and the services that they need. So
you know,
there are disparities in that area.
Yeah, Northern Marianas, I mean, you all have gone through much more devastation than what my residents went through a couple weeks ago with the historic rainfall and the impact of climate change. I mean, people's basements, city halls, one of my hospitals was completely flooded. I can't imagine, again, the families in Northern Marianas was going through, I mean, on top of all of that, the economic struggles have worsened because of climate change. Can you talk a little bit about that in that connection? Because I think we need to also do much more investment, not only in direct services and social services, but dealing with the climate issues and struggles within the Northern Marianas and the territories that continue not to get the investment needed to address that.
Sure. I mean, being in the islands, we really are in many ways on the front lines of climate change. We're dealing with sea level rise, we're dealing with more frequent and severe storms, flooding, and you know, like as I mentioned earlier, we were just barely beginning to recover from one catastrophic typhoon, and then we were slammed with another that was even worse than before. And I think that we can expect this to happen, and we really need to be better prepared and better supported, and we need more federal investment really to help us build a more resilient community.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Representative Sablan, for your passion and your commitment to your residents. I yield.
Yeah, thank you. Just for the record, for everyone's information, Super Typhoon U2 that we experienced, 3 years ago, maybe, was the second largest typhoon recorded in America's history. Because it was so far away in the Marianas, so remote, we had 3 minutes of coverage on our national media. I now recognize Mr. Costa. Mr. Costa, sir, you have 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for holding this very important hearing for the territories of the United States. No one has spoken with greater passion and tenacity of the challenges facing not only the Northern Marianas, but all of the territories, because you know it personally, and you are an excellent representative on their behalf. The fact is that there are so many barriers that we know, from equal access to Medicaid that you tell us about all the time, the problems dealing with SSI, Supplemental Social Security programs, and the Supplemental Nutritional Access Program, SNAP. I mean, as you know, and you have family in the San Joaquin Valley, we share in common so many people that are among dependent upon, you know, that supplemental nutrition programs, SNAP, as otherwise known as food stamps. Almost 25% of my constituents, second highest in California, rely on that. And then, of course, you've got the other challenges that you face with the incredible diversity that is reflected, whether we're talking about the Marianas, whether we're talking about American Samoa, the Pacific territories that the United States, so these are Americans. And as you tell us all the time, Mr. Chairman, they should be treated as all American citizens. We think should be treated in terms of equal access and opportunity. And the diversity is so rich. You know, whether we're talking about Puerto Rico or other parts of this incredible country that stretches into the oceans, climate change, just as it's a factor here, is even more pressing with the low-level islands. And being a sailor, as you know I am, I understand the impacts. The typhoon that you cited 3 years ago, I followed. It had devastation and its impact, in which some of the repairs have still not been done. So I want to indicate to you and to the efforts that we're engaged in the committee that we do everything possible in the efforts, not only with our budget process here by October 1, but the bipartisan infrastructure package and the Reconciliation Act, that we provide the territories the support that they deserve, period. And I will do everything I possibly can to support your efforts, because we're all in this together. We shouldn't forget the important role. So I want to thank you for holding this important hearing. And if there are some areas that you think we should focus on the committee, I listen very carefully to always the points you make on behalf of your constituency.
So
they should know they're well represented.
Would the gentleman use time?
Yes.
All right, thank you. So just for information, our information, you know, I was also very happy to join Ms. Gonzalez Colon in her amendment yesterday, which would, I think, prohibit Department of Justice to use funds to defend cases that sort of restrict the use of SSI, just restrict, you know, benefits, SSI benefits, if I'm not mistaken. And I understand that amendment was in order, and credit goes to Ms. Gonzalez. That should also help. Hopefully, Mr. Jacob, I am sir touched by those, by your client, the injustice that she has to suffer. So, and it puts us in a position because SSI does apply to the Northern Marianas, and I see the benefits that the program does for those who need the help the most. And so I just am thought. So I yield my time.
Well, you've raised the issue of the supplemental security income before, and I think we must do everything we can to provide equity and fairness, whether we're talking about the Northern Marianas, America Samoa, Guam, you know, Puerto Rico, the U.S. Virgins. I was good to see that our former colleague, Donna Christensen, testified earlier, and you have put together a good hearing today. But we must all work together to achieve these goals, and I'm completely committed to supporting your efforts.
Thank you.
Hi, Donna. How you doing?
Thank you, Mr. Costa. Ms. Gonzalez Colon, you have 15 seconds, 20 seconds. Do you have anything to add, Jennifer?
Yeah, first of all, thank you. The amendment you were referring was introduced by Congressman Plaskett, and we all are sponsors of that amendment. That I think is important. I want to add yes something, and just regarding Mr. Penn's question about the cash benefits for Puerto Rico, those cash benefits are going to be expiring in October of this year, and the rest of the benefits to Puerto Rico are obtained using the EBT program, just as you use it in SNAP program. So I think it's important. That question was important, and I just wanted to lay those facts for the record as well.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Gonzalez. Ms.
And the representative, they may be typhoons in the Pacific, but they're hurricanes in Puerto Rico and the US Virgins.
Yes,
But they're all the same, they're devastating.
right, and cyclones in the South Pacific. So, but Ms. Solomon, I do thank you for your written testimony on this the level what you call it, the flat funding even in the bipartisan energy and commerce bills that was approved last week. I can't refuse that bill, but the goal for myself, I know, and for me, all of my colleagues is to get into the full program. Thank you very much. And let me see. So I thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. It's surely wonderful to have a President Biden and the administration and the Democrats in the majority so we could address these issues, huge issues that benefit Americans regardless of their political stripes. But the members of the committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we will ask you to please respond to this in writing under Committee Rule 3.0. Members of the committee must submit witness questions within 3 business days following the hearing, and the hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for these purposes. If there is no further business without objection, the committee stands adjourned.